Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The metallic sound of the gate being installed echoed through Robert Turner's property in Fairfield, Connecticut, marking the end of an era of uncontrolled passage through his land. As he watched the workers finish installing the security fence, Robert adjusted his gold-framed glasses and took a deep breath, knowing that his decision would cause controversy in the neighborhood. "Mr. Turner, everything is ready," said Mike, the installation supervisor, wiping the sweat from his brow. "The security system is connected and the cameras are working perfectly." Robert nodded, examining the finished job. The 5-acre property which he had bought 3 months ago for a considerable price was finally protected. The land, strategically located between the luxurious Maple Grove Estates condominium and the bustling Fairfield Galleria shopping center, had been used informally as a shortcut for years long before its acquisition. Margaret Stevens, president of the Maple Grove Estates Homeowners Association (HOA), was quick to show up. Her white Mercedes-Benz parked abruptly next to the new gate, and she emerged from the vehicle with an expression that mixed indignation and determination. "Robert, what does that mean?" Her voice cut through the afternoon air like a sharp blade. "You can't just close a passage that people have been using for decades." Robert remained calm, already expecting this confrontation. "Actually, Margaret, I can. This is private property, duly registered and documented. The informal right-of-way was never made official, and after the 3 accidents I documented last month, liability has become a risk I can't ignore." Jennifer Brooks, HOA vice president and close ally of Margaret, joined the discussion, stepping out of her own vehicle. "You are harming hundreds of families who depend on this road for their daily routines." "Ladies," Robert replied, maintaining a professional tone, "I understand the inconvenience, but the alternative route adds only 7 minutes to the commute. I can't risk being sued if someone gets hurt here." Margaret pulled out her phone, her fingers typing furiously. "I'm calling the police." "This is absurd." 15 minutes later, 2 Fairfield police cars arrived at the scene. Officer Davidson, a veteran of the department, assessed the situation with experience. "Mrs. Stevens, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. Mr. Turner is within his legal rights. This is private property, and he has all the necessary documentation." Margaret's frustration was palpable. "This passage has existed for over 20 years. Doesn't that count for anything?" "Not without a formal registered agreement, no," the officer explained. "Informal use doesn't establish legal rights in this case." Jennifer whispered something in Margaret's ear, who nodded slowly, a calculated smile appearing on her face. "Very good, Robert. You'll find it's not that simple. The HOA has its resources." Over the next few days, Robert realized that the conflict had only just begun. Margaret and Jennifer began an aggressive campaign on local social media, painting him as an insensitive villain who was harming the community. Posters appeared in Maple Grove Estates with his photo and the phrase "enemy of the community." The situation came to a head when Robert arrived home one Thursday to find a group of around 50 residents led by Margaret and Jennifer holding a protest on his property. "Property for the people," they shouted in unison, holding placards and blocking his entrance. Robert immediately contacted his lawyer, Richard Martinez, who had foreseen this possibility. "Document everything, Robert. Every moment. It only strengthens our case." While discreetly filming the illegal demonstration from inside his car, Robert noticed something disturbing. Some protesters began to vandalize his fences while Margaret and Jennifer pretended not to see. Officer Davidson returned this time with reinforcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are on private property without authorization. You must disperse immediately, or you will be arrested for trespassing." Margaret stepped forward, brandishing a document. "We have a petition with over 300 signatures demanding the reopening of this passage. The community has rights." "The law is clear, Ms. Stevens," replied the officer. "Petitions are no substitute for property rights. This is your final warning to leave the site peacefully." As the police dispersed the protesters, Robert remained in his car watching. His mind wandered to the reason he had bought this property, a dream to build a rehabilitation center for war veterans, something that would honor the memory of his younger brother who had died in combat in Afghanistan. That night, after the riot, Robert sat in his office reviewing the security recordings and organizing the documentation of the incident. His phone rang. It was Richard Martinez. "Robert, we need to talk about more assertive legal measures." Margaret Stevens has a history of similar actions on other properties. She tried something similar with a commercial property last year, but gave up when the owner threatened a harassment suit. "Do what's necessary, Richard," Robert replied, his resolve stronger than ever. "I will not allow intimidation and bullying tactics to compromise my rights or my plans for this property." As the evening progressed, Robert knew he was only at the beginning of a bigger battle. Margaret Stevens and the HOA clearly wouldn't give up easily, but neither would he. This property represented more than just an investment. It was a chance to create something meaningful, something that could really make a difference in people's lives. The morning after the protest, Robert Turner found his mailbox full of anonymous letters with veiled threats and demands to reopen the passage. As he sorted through the mail at his desk, a court notice caught his eye. Margaret Stevens had filed a class-action lawsuit claiming a customary right-of-way. "They really don't waste any time," Robert muttered to himself, quickly typing a message to his lawyer. Richard Martinez replied almost instantly, "I'm on my way. Don't make any public statements until we talk." While waiting for his lawyer, Robert decided to review the security recordings from the night before. The footage clearly showed Jennifer Brooks directing some protesters to strategically damage parts of the fence, evidence that could prove crucial later on. The sound of the doorbell interrupted his analysis. Richard Martinez entered the office carrying a thick briefcase and a serious expression on his face. "Robert, the situation is more complex than we imagined." Richard began spreading documents out on the table. "Margaret Stevens has significant political connections. I found out that she's the cousin of Councilman James Wilson, who, coincidentally, is proposing new legislation on rights-of-way on private property." Robert adjusted his glasses, examining the documents. "That explains how quickly she managed to organize everything. What's our strategy?" "First, we'll file a countersuit for property damage and harassment," Richard explained. "I have the images of the protest here, and witnesses who confirm Margaret and Jennifer's direct participation in organizing illegal activities." While they were discussing their legal strategy, Robert's cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was a post on the Facebook community group. Margaret had shared an old photo of the property, showing children using the shortcut to get to school. "Look how Robert Turner is destroying community traditions," the caption read. "Our children now have to take a dangerous detour because of the greed of an outsider." "This is defamation," Richard observed, taking notes. "They're deliberately distorting the facts. The dangerous detour she mentions is a paved street with sidewalks and crosswalks." That afternoon, Robert received an unexpected visit from Officer Davidson. "Mr. Turner, I thought you should know," the officer began, looking uncomfortable. "The HOA is planning something bigger. I've heard rumors that they intend to organize a community action day next weekend. Apparently, they plan to bring in heavy equipment." Robert felt a tightening in his stomach. "Do they intend to tear down my fences?" "I can't confirm that, but I suggest you beef up security," Davidson replied. "And keep your cameras running." Richard immediately filed for a restraining order, but the judge assigned to the case, Theodore Hammond, was known for his slowness in preliminary rulings. In the following days, the tension continued to escalate. Jennifer Brooks began circulating a petition among the mall's merchants claiming that the closure of the walkway was drastically affecting their business. Robert, for his part, hired a private security company to patrol the property 24 hours a day. During a meeting with his architect to discuss the plans for the rehabilitation center, Robert received a disturbing call from his sister Claire. "Rob, you need to see this," she said, sending a link over the phone. It was a video of Margaret Stevens at a town council meeting, crying as she described how the closure of the crossing had destroyed the community spirit of Fairfield. "Whole families are suffering," Margaret dramatized in a video. "Elderly people can no longer walk to the pharmacy. Children have to wake up an hour earlier to get to school." Robert turned off the video, feeling his blood pressure rise. "Claire, you know that none of this is true. The alternative route is completely accessible." "I know, but it's gaining public support. People love a dramatic story." That evening, while Robert was reviewing the designs for the rehabilitation center, he heard a noise coming from outside. Security cameras showed a group of teenagers trying to cut through the fence in a less well-lit part of the property. Private security intercepted the youths, who admitted that they had been encouraged by Jennifer Brooks, who had promised to pay them $100 each to reopen the path to the community. "That's the final nail in their coffin," Richard declared the next morning when Robert showed him the recordings. inciting minors to commit vandalism. Judge Hammond won't like that at all. But Margaret Stevens had one more trick up her sleeve. That afternoon, she called an impromptu press conference in front of Robert's property. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, perfectly groomed for the cameras. "I have documents here proving that this passage was in fact included in old municipal plans as a planned public road. Mr. Turner is not only violating community rights, but also ignoring the historical planning of our city." Robert watched the live broadcast with Richard by his side, both analyzing every word carefully. "These documents," Richard explained, "are from a project that was never approved in 1978. They have no legal value whatsoever, but she knows how to manipulate the narrative." "What about the rehabilitation center?" asked Robert, worried about his original project. "All this circus is delaying everything." "Stay focused on the end goal," advised Richard. "The more they attack, the stronger our case gets. Every illegal action they take is further proof that you made the right decision in closing off access." The sun was setting over Fairfield when Robert finally had a quiet moment to reflect. On his desk, next to the legal documents and architectural plans, was a photo of his brother in military uniform. It was for him and for all the veterans who needed help that this battle was worth it. His phone rang again. It was Officer Davidson with more news about the HOA's plans for the weekend. The war was far from over, and Robert knew he would need all his determination to face what lay ahead. The peace of the morning was interrupted by the thundering sound of heavy machinery. Robert Turner rushed to his window, and his heart almost stopped. 3 large excavators were positioned on the border of his property, with Margaret Stevens and Jennifer Brooks supervising the operation, accompanied by a sizable group of Maple Grove Estates residents. "It's time to take direct action," shouted Margaret into a megaphone. "If the authorities don't help us, we'll clear our own path." Robert immediately activated a security system and called the police. While he was waiting, he contacted Richard Martinez. "They've finally lost their minds," said Robert, filming the scene with his cell phone. "They brought heavy equipment to break down my fences." "Perfect," replied Richard, surprisingly calm. "Keep filming. This is exactly what we needed to get the emergency injunction." Officer Davidson arrived with 4 backup vehicles, but the situation was already out of control. Jennifer Brooks had climbed onto one of the excavators and was trying to convince the operator to move against the fence. "Ladies," Davidson announced over the car's loudspeaker, "you have exactly 5 minutes to disperse this group and remove the equipment, or you will all be arrested for attempted destruction of private property." It was at this point that something unexpected happened. One of the residents of Maple Grove Estates, an elderly man called Frank Miller, advanced towards Margaret with an envelope in his hand. "Enough of this madness," shouted Frank, his voice shaking with anger. "Show them the truth, Margaret, or I will." Margaret's face paled visibly. Jennifer climbed down from the excavator and ran to her side, whispering something in her ear. Robert watched the scene with growing interest. Frank Miller approached him, handing him the envelope. "Mr. Turner, I'm a former HOA board member," Frank explained. "These documents show why Margaret is so obsessed with her property. It's not about the shortcut, it never was." Inside the envelope were records of a commercial development proposal dated 6 months before Robert bought the land. Margaret and Jennifer had secretly tried to negotiate the sale of the informal passage to a developer who was planning to build a shopping center to rival the Fairfield Galleria. They were going to profit personally from the sale, Frank continued. "When you bought the property, you ruined their plans. All this theater about community rights is a facade to hide the fact that they missed an opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of the residents." Richard Martinez, who had just arrived, examined the documents with professional interest. "That explains a lot, especially Councilman Wilson's involvement. His name is on several of these preliminary contracts." Officer Davidson approached the group, having already dispersed the crowd and secured the removal of the bulldozers. "Mr. Turner, would you like to press charges?" "Yes," replied Robert, his voice firm. "And not just for this attempted break-in. I want a full investigation into possible fraud and misuse of HOA resources." Over the next few days, the story exploded in the local media. Frank Miller provided more documents revealing a pattern of questionable behavior in Margaret and Jennifer's management. Other residents began to speak out, sharing stories of intimidation and manipulation. During an emergency HOA meeting called by the residents themselves, Robert was invited to present his plans for the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. The reaction was surprisingly positive. "My son served in Iraq," said a lady in the front row with tears in her eyes. "A place like this would have made all the difference when he came back." Margaret and Jennifer, sitting at the back of the hall, watched in silence as their house of cards crumbled. Counselor Wilson announced his withdrawal from the discussion on rights of way, citing conflict of interest. Robert took the opportunity to propose a compromise. He would build a safe, well-lit pedestrian crossing on the side of his property, exclusively for residents of the neighborhood, with access controlled by badges. "I can't maintain the driveway for safety and liability reasons," he explained, "but we can create an alternative that benefits the community without compromising the main purpose of the property." The proposal was met with applause. A new HOA board was elected the same night, with Frank Miller taking over as president temporarily until new elections. When Robert returned home that evening, he found Claire waiting on his doorstep. "I saw it on the news," she said, hugging her brother. "Finally, the truth has come out." Robert smiled, tired but satisfied. "You know what's ironic? If they just talked to me from the start, we could have reached an agreement a lot sooner." "Greed does that to people," Claire replied. "But now you can get on with your plans." Jason would be proud. The next morning, while supervising the start of construction on the rehabilitation center, Robert received an unexpected visit from Jennifer Brooks. "I came to apologize," she said, visibly uncomfortable. "Margaret, she has a way of making people believe they're doing the right thing even when they're not." Robert watched her for a moment before replying. "Sometimes doing the right thing means admitting when you're wrong. You've taken the first step." The story of Margaret Stevens and Jennifer Brooks quickly became Fairfield's most talked-about scandal. The Fairfield Chronicle published an extensive investigative report detailing the developer's scheme and the HOA's attempts to manipulate it. Local social media, which had previously been buzzing with criticism of Robert Turner, was now overflowing with indignation against the association's former leaders. Robert watched all this with a mixture of relief and concern as he oversaw the start of construction on the rehabilitation center. The architect had incorporated the new pedestrian walkway into the design, creating a harmonious integration with the rest of the property. "The foundations start next week," explained Steve Harrison, the engineer in charge, as they reviewed the plans. "The controlled access system for the pedestrian crossing will be installed first, as promised to the community." A knock on the door interrupted the meeting. It was Claire, accompanied by a man Robert immediately recognized from the news photos, David Chun, the county prosecutor. "Mr. Turner," Chun began after the formal introductions, "we need to talk about additional evidence that has come to light. Apparently, this is not an isolated case." Over the next 2 hours, Chun revealed a disturbing pattern. Margaret and Jennifer had been involved in similar schemes in 2 other cities in the state. Using their positions in community associations, they tried to force property owners to sell strategic land to specific developers. "Councilman Wilson is cooperating with the investigation," Chin explained. "Apparently he was manipulated just as much as the others." Margaret convinced him that commercial development would be beneficial to the city, hiding her personal interest in the deal. Claire, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. "Rob, you should see what's happening at Maple Grove Estates. It's like a curtain has been lifted." Indeed, the community was undergoing a transformation. Frank Miller, as interim president of the HOA, had organized a complete audit of the association's finances. It was discovered that Margaret and Jennifer had diverted funds intended for neighborhood maintenance to finance their legal maneuvers and smear campaigns. "Mr. Turner," said Chun, "we'll need your formal testimony next week. But there's something else you should know. Jennifer Brooks is willing to cooperate fully in exchange for a settlement." Robert pondered the information. Jennifer had shown sincere repentance, unlike Margaret, who continued to deny all the accusations, even in the face of the evidence. That afternoon, while walking around the estate with Claire, Robert noticed a group of Maple Grove Estates residents approaching the construction site. His first instinct was apprehension, but he soon realized that they were friendly faces. "Mr. Turner," said an elderly woman who introduced herself as Dorothy Wells, "we've come to offer our support to the rehabilitation center. Many of us have family members who are veterans, and we understand the importance of this project." The group had organized an initiative to create a volunteer program once the center was operational. The idea was to establish a real bridge between the community and the veterans who would be served. "We want to turn something negative into something positive," Dorothy explained. This property, which has been the source of so much discord, can become a symbol of healing and unity. Richard Martinez arrived later with news from the court. Judge Hammond had issued a court order barring Margaret Stevens from going near the property or having any involvement with neighborhood associations in the state. She is facing serious charges, Richard reported. The DA found evidence of fraud in multiple jurisdictions. Jennifer Brooks has agreed to testify, which further strengthens the case. As the afternoon turned into evening, Robert organized a small meeting at his home with Claire, Richard, Frank Miller, and some of the residents who had offered their support to the project. It was time to transform the narrative of conflict into one of reconciliation and progress. "I've thought a lot about how we can make this work for everyone," said Robert, unrolling the updated plans on the living room table. "The rehabilitation center will have community areas that can be used for neighborhood events. The pedestrian walkway will be well lit and monitored, ensuring safety for everyone." Frank Miller, who had brought his experience in community management, suggested the creation of a mixed advisory board with representatives from both the center and the community to ensure open and transparent communication. What Margaret and Jennifer didn't understand, Frank reflected, is that true community development comes from cooperation, not manipulation. Claire watched her brother with pride. Robert had turned a potentially disastrous situation into an opportunity to create something meaningful and unifying. Jason always said that the worst circumstances can bring out the best in people, she commented, holding up a photo of her deceased brother. "I think he was right." As the evening progressed and the plans solidified, it became clear that the story of Robert Turner and his estate was becoming something greater than a simple dispute over territory. It was a lesson in integrity, perseverance, and the power of truth to unite a divided community. "Tomorrow we start a new chapter," said Robert, observing the hopeful faces around him. "And this time we're going to write it together." A year has passed since the tumultuous dispute that divided the Fairfield community. The Turner Rehabilitation Center for Veterans was about to open its doors, its modern facade harmoniously integrated into the local landscape. Robert watched the final preparations for the opening ceremony, reflecting on how a battle over a simple passageway had triggered such profound changes. Margaret Stevens' trial had ended 2 months ago, resulting in her conviction for fraud and misuse of resources. Jennifer Brooks, fulfilling her cooperation agreement, received a more lenient sentence and was doing community service, ironically part of it at the rehabilitation center itself. Mr. Turner, Dorothy Wells' voice brought him back to the present. She was now coordinating the center's volunteer program. Representatives from the National Veterans Association have arrived for the final inspection. Robert adjusted his tie and followed Dorothy into the main lobby. The building was a masterpiece of inclusive design, wide corridors illuminated by natural light, welcoming living areas, and has promised a safe and well-planned pedestrian walkway connecting Maple Grove Estates to the mall. Frank Miller, who had been officially elected president of the HOA, arrived accompanied by a group of residents. Under his leadership, the association had become a model of transparent and participatory governance. "I never imagined that all that mess would lead us here," commented Frank, admiring the memorial dedicated to veterans in the Central Garden. "You know what's most ironic? Margaret always talked about preserving the value of community, but it was precisely her departure that allowed us to discover the true meaning of that." Claire appeared, carrying a box of old photographs. Among them, a special one captured Jason Turner in his military uniform, smiling alongside his platoon mates. The photo would take pride of place on the center's main wall. Claire called out, her voice breaking, "Look who's here." 3 men who had served with Jason approached in uniform. They had traveled from different states to attend the opening. The center represented more than Robert's personal project. It was a symbol of hope for veterans across the country. Jennifer Brooks, who was organizing materials for the center's library, stopped her work to observe the scene. Her redemption process had been genuine, and she now devoted her free time to helping others understand the importance of respecting property and individual rights. "Mr. Turner," said Jennifer, approaching hesitantly, "I received a letter from Margaret today. She wants me to give it to you." It was a simple envelope sealed by hand. Robert opened the letter right then and there. Margaret's words, written from prison, expressed a belated but sincere regret. She had finally understood how her obsession with control and power had damaged so many lives. Time in prison taught me more about community than 20 years of running an HOA, she wrote. Here where I have no control over anything, I have learned the true value of mutual respect. The opening ceremony began at dusk. Hundreds of people gathered in the large auditorium, local residents, veterans, authorities, and even some of the former protesters who had opposed the project. Richard Martinez, sitting in the front row, was smiling with satisfaction. The case had become an important precedent in disputes involving HOAs, establishing clear boundaries between community rights and private property. Robert took the stage for his speech, carrying with him the weight and honor of the moment. A year ago, this property was divisive, he began. Today, it represents unity, not just among our local community, but among all those who have sacrificed so much for our country. This center exists because we believe that scars, whether physical or emotional, heal best when we are not alone. Officer Davidson, now promoted to sergeant, watched from the audience. His balanced presence during the crisis had contributed significantly to preventing the conflict from escalating further. After the speech, while the guests explored the facilities, Robert found a quiet moment in the memorial garden. The pedestrian walkway, softly lit in the twilight, was being used by some residents, a silent symbol of how compromise and understanding can resolve even the most heated conflicts. Claire joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. Jason would be proud, she said softly, not just of the center, but of how you turned a conflict into something that benefits so many people. The sound of laughter caught her attention. A group of veterans were chatting animatedly with residents of Maple Grove Estates, planning joint activities. The invisible barrier that used to divide the estate had become a connecting bridge. Dorothy Wells approached with encouraging news. The volunteer program already had a waiting list for the next 6 months. People want to be part of it, she explained. It's as if the community has discovered a new purpose. At the end of the evening, Robert locked his office and walked to his car. The property that had once been the scene of protests and conflicts now radiated peace and purpose. The security cameras were still there, but their purpose had changed, no longer to document confrontations, but to protect a space for healing and renewal. Sometimes, thought Robert driving home, we need a storm to clear the air and show us what really matters. The moon softly illuminated the sign of the Turner Rehabilitation Center for Veterans, a permanent reminder that the greatest victories don't always come from battles won, but from transformed hearts and communities united by a purpose greater than their differences.